Theodore Dalrymple, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
You're of particular interest because of your books, including Life at the Bottom and Not With a Bang But a Whimper. And they're of interest because what we've been trying to do over the last few weeks and will do is consider what does it mean to be a good person or a bad person. And it does seem from those books that you've had the opportunity to meet a few people who might not be regarded as so good, and you might have some insight into those people who the community might generally regard as being bad.
Yeah.
What can you say from your experience as a prison psychiatrist? How can you help us with grappling with what does it really mean to be good or bad?
Well, of course, it's a very difficult question. One thing that I think has happened is, and this I think is the responsibility of intellectuals, is that increasingly they think that to be a good person is to have the right opinions rather than to act in the right way. And they seem to feel responsibility for things in inverse proportion to their real influence on them. Consider their own behaviour as being terribly important, but they consider, shall we say, their attitude to the environment to be extremely important.
Is this a bit like the people who perhaps go to confession and then go out and recommit the same sins?
Well, I suppose it's the same, except that when they're confessing to things that they've actually done, so at least they've got a sense of their own sin. They're not talking about carbon dioxide emission, but what they've actually done. So one sees that people's concerns, as I said, are more and more, seem to be more and more abstract rather than behaving well in their own little restricted worlds.
Well, what does it mean to behave well? If being a good person doesn't mean having the so-called right opinions, but rather means to behave in a decent way, is there a reasonably short-form way we can encapsulate for young people who might be listening what it means to behave in a decent way?
Well, I think it's to behave with consideration for others. That's a very large part of it. I mean, it's a very banal thing to say, but I think it's true. And so things like politeness are very important. And as I said, consideration, lack of egotism is very important. And I think there is an immense amount of egotism that has been fostered. For example, the idea of self-esteem is a very popular one, and I think it's a completely junky, in fact, I think it's a very bad concept.
And why so?
Because...
What's the matter with having some self-esteem?
I think self-respect and self-esteem are two different things. Self-respect is a social virtue in the sense that you make an effort, and largely on behalf of other people. So that's important. Self-esteem is just thinking well of yourself, in a sense, irrespective of what it is that you do, whether you're of any value to other people, whether you make any efforts, and so on. And people think that they have some kind of almost right to self-esteem. They should think of themselves in a good light, irrespective, actually, of what they've done, what they are, what their efforts are, whether they help other people, and so on and so forth.
Having large numbers of people focusing on whether they have an appropriate level of self-esteem lead to bad things for the community at large. For example, a sense of self-satisfaction, perhaps indolence, there's nothing I need to do because I am a nice or decent person.
Yes, I think it makes people self-important, frankly, and egotistical, whereas self-respect has the opposite effect and is a striving. Self-esteem is something that people feel that they have a right, almost a right to. They feel they ought to have it, and that it doesn't come as a result of activity.
It's just theirs as of right.
Yes.
Yes. In another context, I believe it might have been a book review, you wrote once that, as I understand it, that sentimentality is a hardness of heart that masquerades as feeling.
Yes.
Could you help me with that? I must say I struggled with that a little bit. I like to think of sentimentality as being a softness, and a niceness and in fact, an element of caring.
Well, it's difficult because, of course, things are not either or. But I think Oscar Wilde said something good about sentimentality. He said it's the desire to have the emotion without paying for it. In other words, you just indulge in the emotion for its own sake, and it ends up being bogus, and often actually is a flip side of brutality. And we've become very sentimental, for example, about children. In a book I wrote about sentimentality, I quoted a little thing that I saw in the local newspaper where a man was complaining about a supermarket because he had some chicken, and his child found a chicken's foot in the chicken and started screaming, and he said, oh, that was the end of the meal. We had to throw the whole meal out. And he had obviously taken on the distress of the child, thinking that by doing so, he was being very kind, doing the right thing, seeing it from the child's point of view. Instead of which he should have said, well, of course, chicken have feet, just get on with your meal. And what he was probably using this kind of sentimentality for was an attempt to obtain compensation from the shop that he bought the chicken from.
Yes. The sentimentality comment I now recall, I believe, was made in the context of people saying we should find other things to do with prisoners than putting them in jail. And your point of view at the time was that, look, jail may not be perfect. It may not, in a sense, be a cure-all. That is, prisoners come out of jail and don't reoffend. We all know it doesn't work in that context. But just because it doesn't work doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. In other words, leaving people out to continue to rob other people's houses is a very bad idea.
Yes. I mean, it depends what you think prison is. If you think it's therapy, then, of course, it is a complete failure. But actually it's not quite complete, because in Britain some research was done to show that the recidivism rate did actually go down with the length of sentence. So the longer the sentence, the less likely a person was to reoffend, which is not altogether surprising. But the main purpose is incapacitation of someone who has repeatedly shown that he's not going to abide by fairly elementary rules. And actually, it's very easy to show, I can't speak for Australia because I don't know the figures in Australia, but it's very easy to show in England that the reoffending rate of people who are on community sentences, that is to say, who are doing probation or some other so-called sentence, their reoffending rate is several 100%. And in fact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of crimes are committed by people who are already convicted of crimes and serving community sentences. So in other words, these community sentences are actually promoting crime. And what one has to remember is that the main victims of crime are not rich people. They're not people like me. They're poor people. It is true that criminals, on the whole, come from the poorer sections of society. But it is also true that their victims come from the poorer section of society. And since the class of victims is many times larger than the class of perpetrator, it follows that failure to incapacitate the criminal is very unpleasant, is very harmful to the poor.
Yes, indeed. Can we move on to another topic that I understand has taken your interest, and that is the Olympics?
Yeah.
And in particular, an article, or the sentiments contained therein, called An Orgy of Self-Congratulation. And I thought I should share with you that we didn't have that kind of orgy in Australia. We had one of self-flagellation because we were very unhappy that we didn't win the swimming medals that we thought we should have. As of right, of course, because we're Australians, we think we should be able to win these swimming medals. But it does raise the question of the Olympics generally, and whether we should in fact be pouring all the money we do into this pretty fantastic event that happens every 4 years, for which most of the commercialisation doesn't seem to have a terrible amount to do with the athletes.
Yes. No, I'm totally opposed to it, and I think it's all rather horrible. And the idea of a country congratulating itself because it's won a lot of medals is a kind of almost totalitarian mindset. And of course the totalitarian countries did actually use the Olympics to demonstrate the superiority of their system. I think it's wrong to congratulate yourself on having a lot of medals, and I think it's wrong to flagellate yourself for not having won a lot of medals. The most sensible, in fact the only sensible country that I can really think of is India, which didn't win many medals despite the fact that India is, a sixth of the world's population, because the Indians studiously refuse to get enthusiastic about this thing, and I think that is the correct attitude. They don't prevent, of course it's a reasonably free country, so they don't prevent anyone from participating if he wishes, but he has to be a genuine amateur. So I think India came out of it very well.
Yes. What could we do to allow athletes who, I personally think it's a perfectly fair thing to have as an aspiration that you want to be the fastest swimmer or the best basketball team or whatever. That's not a bad thing, but I'm not convinced that the Olympics remains the appropriate forum in which to do that, because of all the shenanigans that go on about choosing which country will host it, and within the sporting administrations how they pick the teams. It's all just got an air about it that's not attractive. But do you agree it's a fair thing for an athlete to want to be the best in the world?
Yes, although I mean, this is my personal feeling. It's not an achievement that I personally value terribly highly.
Sure. Well, we all have different. I
mean, I would think it's a better thing to be a good piano player. I would say that is a much higher aspiration.
Sure, but
it's not wrong. No, it's not wrong.
We all have different aspirations, and someone who wants to play a piano, well and good, but most of them don't do it as a charity either. You know, they're all very keen to have the, I don't know what you would call it, a platinum record these days.
Yeah.
It seems that, well, not whatever field, but in so many fields, people have a great desire to be popular, and perhaps being the best or the highest selling CD for a pianist seems to indicate some sort of popularity that makes us feel better about ourselves.
Yes, never having had that experience, I can't...
No, me either, I can assure you. I'm definitely not built to be an athlete. No doubt about that, and I'm trying to learn the piano, but it's a slow process.
Yes. I think it's much better that large numbers of people participate in sport because they enjoy doing it. And part of enjoyment is, of course, mastering the skill and being better than other people, so I'm in favour of competitive sport. But I'm certainly not in favour of, I dislike the exaggerated emphasis on it, which I can see in my own country. I don't know. I don't think Australia is particularly keen on football, soccer, but in Britain it is, and it exerts an almost... You're almost forced into pretending, at any rate, that you're interested in it. And if you take our newspapers, for example, The Times, it has far more about football than all world news put together.
Australia might fit in the same category. As you say, you don't know about Australia. I understand soccer is the fastest growing sport.
In Australia.
In Australia, and we play our own particular football league and a couple of different types of rugby, and it's quite right that large portions of our newspaper are devoted to coverage of these sports that many people are interested in, but many are not. Can I come back to the question of competitive sport, put the Olympics aside?
Yeah.
Back on the point that you made that it's not just about having self-esteem because you're entitled to it, but some self-respect. Isn't it true that being good at something and getting recognition for that, not necessarily in the form of a medal, just recognition that you are good at this particular thing, is a good thing and does in fact help us have respect for ourselves?
Yes, but we also have to put, I think, the various things that we want to be good at in some kind of hierarchy of achievement.
And sport doesn't necessarily rate at the top.
Yes. Not for me. I mean, I know that many others would disagree, but it doesn't for me, no.
Can we move on to another point, and that is charities?
Yes.
There just seem to be an endless number of phone calls going to Australians asking for them to buy a raffle ticket in this or donate to that, and if you care, you'll do this. And for so many, it's a way of demonstrating to themselves that they are good people because they give to this charity or whatever. But there is a growing concern in Australia that charities don't always behave as ideally as we might like. In fact, the government has introduced legislation to try and require charities to be more upfront and transparent in terms of their funding and where it goes and how much actually goes to the person in need of assistance as opposed to the administration of the charity. Is this a problem that's prevalent in the United Kingdom?
Oh, yes. I think we're the world leaders probably in the corruption of charities. I mean, first of all, of course, there are many genuine charities, particularly small local ones. They remain genuine charities, and there are thousands, or in fact hundreds of thousands of them, and there are some large charities which are, in my view, genuinely charitable. But if you look up their accounts online, which is something which is now possible to do very easily, you will find that actually very small amounts of the money is going directly to people in need. And actually they seem to be more careerist orientated. First of all, the directors of charities have very large salaries. There are large numbers of people making quite a good living from it. They use large amounts of money for things like advertising, about 20% of their revenues. They have, I don't know whether you have this in Australia, we have charity shops where people go and give things which charities then sell. There's one organ, the British Red Cross, for example. I looked up its accounts. These charity shops, they get their goods free and they get their labour free. People give their labour free to man these shops, and yet they turn over only 8% of their turnover. They turn that over to the charity. How is that possible? What is happening to the rest?
It must be very, very high rental. Must be very, very high rental for that to be the case. Before I was in Parliament, I was in retailing, and I could assure you, if you're only passing over 8% when you're not paying for your goods and you're not paying for any labour, you must have very, very high rental, or you're skimming some money off for something else.
Exactly. But the thing about the modern world, and particularly Britain, but I can't say about Australia, is that you will find that nothing illegal is actually going on. It's grossly dishonest, but it's not illegal. And if you go into these shops, and they're generally manned by old ladies, I mean, they serve a good function for them. They believe they're doing good and they're doing something for society. And you say to them, how much of the money you take is going to the charity? They look at you wide-eyed and say, well, all of it, of course. That's because they actually do hand over the money without deduction, to some organisation. But very little of that money actually gets to the charitable purposes.
Well,
now, this is, in my view, typical of a form of corruption which is not actually illegal.
Well, I can assure you we have, to a degree, similar problems in Australia. Can we move to one last area, and that is Europe and the current problems that they're facing?
Yeah.
There was an interview in which you participated where, because you asked a question about the European project, you were immediately classified as a Eurosceptic.
Yes.
And further on, because you asked something else and weren't sure that the union was necessarily such a good thing, you found yourself perhaps put in the basket of being a fascist, as if there were only two choices in each of these cases. You're either in favour of the union or you're Eurosceptic. You have to be one or the other. In black and white, in your favour in the union or you're a warmonger. Attributing, apparently, to the union the cause of peace, in some peace at least, and not entirely, in Europe since its inception. Do you find that propensity for journalists to put a proposition to you, which if you accept you are put in the bad boy basket, is a common thing?
I think so, yes. Partly, of course, they don't deal with many things at length, so you have to express your opinion on a complex subject in a single sentence or within 15 seconds. And that reduces everything to schematism. I mean, you have to talk in cliches or sound bites, and you can't qualify anything. And so that means that you get a Manichaean view of the world. There are good people and there are bad people, and if you take one view, you're a bad person. That's, I'm afraid, part of the, particularly the broadcasting media. Not this interview, of course. But
how very kind of you to mention. Well, look, can I assure you that it's been a pleasure for me, and I'm sure it is for our listeners, to have the benefit of your views on these things. For some time, you've given a lot of Australians who are spectator readers permission, if you like, to think in a different way and to open our minds and to be resistant to the onslaught of those who would have us all think one way. It is such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.